So I'd like to talk to you today about how to be a CEO that supports great design. This is based on my observations in working with many of you, and then also based on my own personal experiences, having run design and user experience at Yahoo and at Google, and then also having talked to many colleagues and peers in other companies who have also led design at other great companies. So I'm going to talk about 8 things that you can do. Okay, first thing. Start your design education today. So as CEO, you're probably getting versed on, the technical details of whatever it is that you're doing. You're learning about marketing. You're learning about sales. There's no reason to not also learn about design. And it doesn't mean that you need to learn all about, how to move the pixels around, but you need to understand design principles and what constitutes great design. Because ultimately, within an organization, people are going to be designing to your preferences and your tastes and aesthetic sensibilities, even if you delegate that out to a creative director or like some head of design, because they're interpreting your vision for what the company is and what the product should be. So why study design? Okay, beauty matters. It does. There's this concept called the aesthetic usability effect. So the more beautiful a product is, the more it is perceived to be easy to use. And the more people want to connect to the product. There have been a lot of studies that have found this to be true. Furthermore, users' expectations are higher than ever. All these consumer-facing apps have kind of elevated our own expectations of what good experience should be. So even if you're targeting enterprise customers or whatever, they want the quality of whatever consumer interfaces they're used to also be in the tools that they're using at work. As technology matures, design becomes a differentiator. And so now that technology is becoming ubiquitous, design is more important than ever. And I also want to remind you that good design is not just about how things look, it's also about how they work. And ultimately, design is about how you make people feel. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so how do you know what's good design? I'd like to point you to Dieter Rams' 10 principles for good design. Dieter Rams, for those of you who don't know, was chief design officer at Braun for about 40 or 50 years. And this is thought to be kind of the canonical best definition of what constitutes good design. And so you can Google this and you can find deeper, detailed explanations for each of these principles. But this is a nice thing that you can kind of refer to as you and the rest of your company kind of go through your product or service offering and how you think about what you're giving to people. So, for example, good design is honest. If you're tricking people into clicking on ads that don't look like ads, you can ask yourself, is this good design or not? This is a nice way to calibrate yourself. Moreover, there are principles of good graphic design that are also important to understand. I think there's also a distinction to be made, too, between design and style versus luxury. Some people have said, I'm really into design, and what they're actually really into is luxury. Design can be expensive, but it doesn't have to be only for the luxury market. These are products that come from Muji, which is a Japanese store that's sort of like a Target/IKEA. And their whole design sensibility, their point of view is to bring a quiet sense of calm into people's otherwise busy lives. And so even though these products are very low cost, they are still beautiful. And there's kind of this minimal aesthetic to it. They're not trendy and they're not faddish. They're kind of worth keeping, even though they're not expensive. And when you think about iconic, great design, that's ultimately what it is. It's not trendy or faddish. There's a timeless quality to it. It's a design that endures. And ultimately, that's the design you want to strive to achieve so that you don't find yourself needing to redesign your product aesthetically every couple of months as people's tastes swing back and forth. So if you only have time to read 3 books, what are the 3 books that you should read to learn about design? The first one I recommend is The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. This was a life-changing book for me personally. It's what led me to come into this field. And it just teaches you how to see the world and how to think about why things are the way they are. And as makers of products and services and technologies, what you can do, what is the perspective that you should have to create great design. Second book I recommend is The Elements of User Experience by Jesse James Garrett. This book is a really great primer on the whole spectrum of design, not just design in terms of aesthetics, but how design permeates throughout the whole company all the way to the CEO level, and what that means for the decisions that you make and how that ultimately impact design. And then the third book is the Universal Principles of Design. And this is a nice little encyclopedia of all design principles, theories, and practices that you could possibly imagine. And this is a great way to build up your knowledge and understanding and vocabulary when it comes to design, so that when you work with the people who are designing your technologies or your interfaces, that you can have meaningful conversations with them. Okay, second, get the multidisciplinary skills you need on the team. Okay, user experience fundamentally is multidisciplinary. When I tell CEOs this, sometimes they kind of look kind of crestfallen because they think, I only have headcount for one person. Let me just go through all the different skills that are needed that comprise user experience. The ability to understand users, their needs, behaviors, and motivations. This is typically referred to as user research. The ability to think through an experience. So how do you move people through a site or an experience? How do you help people achieve their goals once you understand from your user research what their goals are? And how do you make that tangible in a way that everybody in the company can understand what it is that you're trying to offer? And then the ability to make the offering aesthetically pleasing so that you have an emotional connection to your users. And then the ability to prototype so that you can kind of put together the concepts, test it out, and iterate, which is different than front-end development, which is the ability to build the offering at a high level of quality and craftsmanship. Now, a lot of times, prototyping and front-end development is the same people doing that, or the same person. And I just want to make the distinction here. It's a difference in mindset. Prototyping is about building throwaway code. It's about hacking together something very quickly to see if a concept will work or not. It's not production-ready code. Front-end development, on the other hand, is production-ready code. It works across, if you're building web technologies, it works across all browsers, all devices, things like that. So it's a very different way of developing. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that you have to hire one of each person? No, it doesn't. And that's not practical for startups. My point here is to say that if you care about design, it's good for you to be aware of all the different skills that are needed to create great experiences, and then for you to think strategically about how do you build these capabilities within your company. So for example, user research, and I'll talk about that later, how you can get that in your company. Let's say visual design. Maybe you have a front-end developer who can build a pretty aesthetically pleasing front-end designed just based on some code libraries like Bootstrap or things like that. So there are hacks that you can do to kind of get most of the way there without all of the skills. Just as important as getting the skills, though, is emotional intelligence. And these are the qualities that I personally look for when I'm hiring designers. I've personally employed over 500 designers in my career and probably rejected many times more than that. And you could say, well, these are the qualities that you would want in almost any hire. And I would say, yes, they're even more important in a creative field like design. You want people who love to make and iterate because you want people to want to constantly improve. You want them to be fearless. So, rather than just like, I don't want to make a mistake, I don't want to come up with something that's bad. You want people who are willing to come up with crazy ideas and not be hampered by this perfectionism mentality. You want people who will provide leadership and be proactive, but you also want people who can be good followers and take direction well. You don't want somebody who's going to be going off in a different vision with a different vision than what you have. Good designers will push themselves to create a lot of different ideas so that it can get to the best one, because very rarely is the first idea the best idea. And when I was starting out as a designer, this was one of the early lessons that I learned from my mentors, was like to force yourself to stretch and create like as many as 10 or 20 different possible solutions for any one single design problem. You want people who are curious and eager to learn. They're going to grow with the company as your company grows. And you want somebody who listens well, because they're working with a lot of stakeholders, and they need to be able to understand all of that and synthesize that, and then work with other people to make sure that there's a solution that is arrived at that people that is meaningful and will work well. One thing I want to note is that in my experience working with a lot of visual designers is that it's not uncommon for people who are visually inclined, like as graphic designers or visual designers, for them to be really poor verbal communicators. But that should not preclude you from hiring those people. Just be aware that sometimes people who don't express themselves verbally may be really awesome designers and vice versa. Okay. So a lot of questions to consider when you're talking about building a team. I won't go too much into this, except to say there's no one right answer for all of you guys. Okay, so whenever I work with our portfolio companies, the answer is always, it depends. And so I'll ask a lot of questions to more deeply understand the situation that you're in. Sometimes it makes sense to hire one or two people who have flexible skills that can cut across all the different skills that's needed. Sometimes it makes sense to not hire a designer at all, and maybe you just go hire a design agency or a small studio to help you with what you need. So, what kind of skills to prioritize, where to recruit from, what level, how do you know a good designer when you see one, all that kind of stuff. That's a whole nother talk that I could give that I'm not going to go into today because I want to be respectful of your time. But I would like to encourage you to go to the KV website and look under the resources section. There's a UX recruiting toolkit that's a very comprehensive brain dump that I wrote about how to build design capabilities within your organization and how to think about that. Okay, number 3. Develop empathy for your users. You have to understand who you're designing for. Just want to give you a couple of examples. This is a ticket counter from a Japanese subway station. And you can see this little plastic strip on the counter's edge. And this little plastic strip is a resting place for your cane or your umbrella. And it really struck me when I saw this because it meant that whoever was designing the ticket counter station really understood kind of the whole experience of what it means to have to, put your stuff down, fish out the money from your pocket, and pay for the ticket. This is not about aesthetics. This is about experience. And moreover, whoever funded the creation of these ticket counters, these ticket stations, supported this idea of paying for this extra strip of plastic and the extra effort that it takes to construct this. That's experience design, and that's an example of a way in which a CEO can support good experience. Similarly, so Google Docs, Microsoft Word, Microsoft Outlook versus Google Docs and Gmail. It's not just about simplifying the functionality and about aesthetics. It's really about understanding what people want to do and what they need to do. I would say, if Google had just tried to replicate the basic functionality of word processing and email and just put it on the cloud, that probably would have been just slightly more interesting than what Word and Outlook were offering. But what people fundamentally wanted to do was to be able to collaborate in terms of Google Docs, and they wanted to be able to just search their email in terms of Gmail. And those kinds of insights about users are what led to these transformative breakthroughs in this product offering. That's experience design. So how do you understand your users? You need to make it someone's job, or maybe everybody's job, to bring user insights into the entire company. And what's the best way to do that? There are a couple of different ways. One is that you could hire a user researcher to join your team. So when I talked about how UX is multidisciplinary, the first skill that I brought up was user research. You could hire a user researcher. The few companies that I've seen that have done this have reaped tremendous benefits from having a full-time user researcher on the team. And a good one can do anything from help you figure out who your target users are, what's the right strategy, what's the right product market fit, what's the right value proposition, all the way down to usability details. If you don't have the resources to hire a full-time researcher, you could hire a consultant. And I've referred many of the portfolio companies to various researchers. Depending on your needs, these researchers can be very strategic, or they can be very focused on, tactical work. The other thing you can do is just to do it yourselves. I've been working with Daterra over the past couple of months. The front-end engineers there, kind of like deer in headlights. They're like, we're building this product, and we don't really understand our users and what their behavioral patterns are. How do we begin to do that and design effectively for them? And for a couple of months, I worked with them to coach them on how to go about doing this user research themselves. And I think Patrick Collison from Stripe also said something about having all the engineers do everything. So that's another example of that. There's no right way or wrong way. A lot of it is contextual. It just depends on your needs and capabilities and how you're inclined to spend your resources. And I often say gathering the research and the user insights can be pretty easy relative to what happens next. And the comparison that I make is like, if you ever took like a Psych 101 class, there's this question of like, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And I think of research in the same way, is that if you do all this research, but it lands on deaf ears, back to the development team, you didn't really do the research. And I think what's hard about getting research done is actually bringing it back to the team and synthesizing in a way that everybody digests it and is inspired and motivated to actually come up with great product features or experiences that really solve people's needs. There are some misconceptions about user research I want to dive into for a moment. Some people think that user research is about asking users what they want. And, there's this saying like, oh, Henry Ford, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horse. Well, that's not what user research is about. User research is about observation. It's about understanding people in their own context and environment and understanding the context of use. You're not asking people what they want. You're watching them and you're seeing how they're struggling and what their needs are. Also, what people say might be different from what they actually do. So it's always a good idea to actually watch people. Another comment that I sometimes hear is that, oh, user research is qualitative. You're just talking to 8 to 10 users at a time, so this isn't really valid scientific research. Yes, user research is messy. It's not really scientific research. It's more like design research, but it doesn't mean that it's not important. It actually doesn't take many conversations or many sessions watching people use your product for you to begin to understand when is something confusing or not. So context matters, and qualitative data is just as important as quantitative data. It often tells you the why behind the what. Okay, fourth, simplify ruthlessly. It's easier said than done. It's easy to say, oh, let's make things simple. Really hard to do. Going back to Dieter Rams, these are some examples of products from Braun in the mid-century, like 1950s or so. And there's this enduring quality about these products that still excites people today. I mean, there's this mid-century modern furniture and architecture is hugely popular these days. Why? It's because it's timeless. It's simple. The way they approached design was to strip away everything that wasn't essential and amplify what was left. And that's how, that's a great way to think about simplification. So what are some strategies for simplifying? Because this is actually a really hard thing to do. Well, the first thing is I'm a pragmatic person. You have to get the fundamentals right. Like if the product doesn't work, it doesn't matter. So the technology has to work. And again, strip away everything that isn't essential and amplify what's left. And optimize for the 80% case. How much will the feature be used? I have a great story from Google's development that I thought was really interesting. In the early days of Google, Google has a very bottom-up culture, especially at that time. The engineers were kind of running the show, and they would come up with all kinds of features for Google search. And Larry, Sergey, Marissa, they all wanted to keep Google simple and keep it streamlined. So how could they do this without making the engineers feel disempowered? So the way that they did it was they created an experimental framework, and they said, okay, any feature that's proposed should go through this experimental framework. We'll put it out to like 1% of our users at a time, which, for the amount of users that Google had, it wouldn't take very long to get a lot of data. You turn it on for like 10 minutes and you can get a lot of meaningful data. And a feature had to be used by at least 80% of the people for it to actually make it through to final production. 80% is a hugely high bar. And so most of the features didn't make the cut. But the engineers were never told no. Like every feature had a chance, and it was seemingly objective. Now, sometimes it's not that easy for you to implement in your company, but I encourage you to think about explicit strategies for, rationalizing what goes into the product and what doesn't. The other thing is that it's a lot harder to take away features than it is to add. So err on the side of not putting a feature in, and testing it out and making sure that it's actually going to be used before you keep it in. Okay, fifth is value the details. Design is all about the details. Sometimes we think, oh, we're too busy for the details. We don't need to worry about that because we're just trying to get to the next round of funding or get the product to work. Here's an example. is here's a photo from, I don't know, some random pedestrian bridge or road, and you can see the railings along here. It just makes you feel like you're in a prison. In contrast, here's an example of railing in Japan. What's that? Uh-oh, technical difficulties. Is that there? Okay, here's an example of a railing in Japan. Here's another example. This is a bridge over a river. And here's another example. They never miss an opportunity to add a little bit of detail and delight, even into the most mundane places. Here's another example. This is a typical manhole cover in the US. In Japan, every single manhole cover has some kind of interesting decoration on it. And so it just makes the whole experience of walking through the city delightful. But attention to detail is not just limited to aesthetics. Okay, here's another example. This is La Bayona Creek in Culver City. Back in the 50s or 60s, US Army Corps of Engineers thought that this was the best way to deal with water, is just to concrete pave everything and direct all the water